Welcome to the FMCG guys. I'm Efren Rosario, joined as always by my co-host, Daniel Torres-Dwyer. Daniel, how are you today?
Very well, very well. Nice to see you, Efrain.
Yeah, likewise. I'm excited for our discussion today. Who do we have joining us?
Yeah, so we have someone that's very high profile. Been in touch with him for a while, so I'm very happy to have him here. His name is Karl Walsh. Maybe part of our audience has heard about him. He's a pretty remarkable leader, I have to say. His last position was the CEO of bodybuilding.com. But prior to this, he occupied two very high profile positions. First as Chief Digital Officer at the American department store JCPenney. And prior to that, he occupied the same position at the Danish jeweler Pandora, brands which I'm sure you've heard about. But wait a minute, because these roles actually came after working at two of the main strategic consulting firms and starting two companies. The reason why we invited him today was to understand how to effectively lead big organizations, but also, and more specifically, drive digital transformation from the highest level. Hi, Karl. Hi again. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Karl. It's great to be with you today. Looking forward to us.
Yeah, likewise.
So, Karl, you and me have spoken a few times. Efrain and you just met each other. But for you to get acquainted with our audience, maybe you can tell us a bit about your career, which is slightly unusual, starting in consulting, going into entrepreneurship, then going into the digital route in corporate. How did you end up here?
Yeah, it was all, it's all sort of following the path that was put in front of me. I joined Accenture in Ireland in 2001 at a college, and I did technology for close on 6 years. Started out in coding, moved into what was not then called product management, but in hindsight is what we call product management. And then I moved to New York to do an MBA, and my goal had been to get into a marketing CPG type world. Because of the visa circumstances in the US and my desire to spend a couple of years after Columbia working in New York, I ended up joining McKinsey and Company and staying in consulting. And there I did a lot of strategy and marketing for consumer and retail, and really really loved the consumer retail space, but had a real itch to operate. And, at Accenture, you're implementing technology to meet the decisions that were made by a strategist. And then at McKinsey, you're building the strategy, but you're really taking inputs from the executive team and how they see the business and helping turn it into a strategy. And yes, you use third parties and best practices, but in the end, you're not just a strategist, you're a facilitator. And it really created an itch in me to actually be the person driving it as opposed to facilitating it. So at that point, I did two entrepreneurial ventures that were quite serendipitous in terms of how they came about. One being meeting a great guy on a plane who was a pretty successful entrepreneur, and another being based on that and people at McKinsey who knew what I'd done. But in effect, I built an e-commerce business and a global database marketing business. The latter very successul, the former not so much, but lots of learnings.
Sorry again. How did that happen exactly? That you just went from McKinsey into smaller businesses?
I mean, quite simply, I was working with a McKinsey client in just outside London, and I stopped off at home in Dublin for the weekend and flew back to New York from Dublin. And the gentleman sitting beside me on the plane was an entrepreneur who was about to found a company. So we spent the best part of 5-6 hours discussing the business he was going to build, which was very linked to the CPG world. And I'm just sort of poking at it and thinking about how you could make it successful and what he was going to do. And then we exchanged details. And then eventually he asked me to go and help him build the business. So that was my first foray into entrepreneurship, basically through a coffee over a flight. I did that. And then I took a sabbatical from McKinsey at one point to help focus on that. At one point or another, with that business, I was in a position where personal life, visas, relationships, etc., just full-time relocating to Ireland wasn't an option. So I left and remained at McKinsey at that point. And then somebody at McKinsey was approached by a former client who was a very successful person who wanted to start something. And they said, we know you know how to start a digital business, will you come and do this one with us? And then into my second one I go. And then actually ended up back in a more commercial role at the first one later in my career. So it was just pure happenstance, really. There was no plan or design around those roles.
But it's interesting though, and I think you kind of touched on this already, which is as somebody who also started his career at Accenture, I started in process, whereas you were in technology. It's interesting to hear you talk about going from that role as a consultant and then really moving into more of a line role. In your case, it was working in the startup role, in essence, starting companies. But I'm curious to hear, what your thoughts were in regards to what were some of the elements that you were able to glean from your time at Accenture and also at McKinsey that were really, in essence, very useful, let's say, in regards to moving into working at its own company as opposed to being a consultant.
Yeah, and I will say this, the mindset and work you do in a startup is very different to what you do when you're in the C-suite of a corporate. But applying it to the startup world, there was a couple of very critical pieces, I think. One is when you're at a place like Accenture, you're implementing technology, it can't fail. Right? So the technology has to work. And startups have more of a fail-fast mindset of, well, let's try things and see how they work. But I came to a place in my mind where I was like, well, yes and no, right? Fail fast, learn fast, but don't fail on purpose. And if you can see where something's not going to work, you may get a false negative because you put the technology in wrong. So one of it was putting some robust discipline around how you implement technology, with the caveat that there are moments when you're going to take risks and try things, but you don't know how it's going to turn out. But when you know this is a piece of functionality you need, then there are ways to do it that are more robust than others, and you got to apply them. You can't just ignore what you learned. And I had team members come to me and say, I had friends who work in SF, they don't have to do it this way, and they're allowed to do with this, and the CEO trusts the team to figure it out. And my general feeling was, well, I can't undo close to a decade of learning a best practice just because some people happen to have an incredible idea and get away with not having best practice. So that's kind of how I felt about implementing the tech, which is something we always succeeded at in my startups. The other piece, I think, taking McKinsey is the muscle memory of seeing how the big companies think and where they're going, and understanding sort of suspension of disbelief is a lovely trait for entrepreneurs at times. But again, you can't unknow what you know, and understanding the reactions of competitive companies and where they may go helps you shape the strategy for a company at any size, right? In terms of, look, the amount of people who come to me and say, I have an idea, wouldn't it be wonderful if, and therefore I'm going to build a company. Well, there's a lot of things that happen after you start that, but mean the if may or may not happen. So you just get a lot of experience with that. And then I think the third one is, startups are not unlike consulting teams at the start. They're small. Everybody's in it for the same reason. This is maybe a time-bound mission, and you all work together. When you're running a corporate, you have to think about somebody's career in 5, 6, 7, 8 years. When you're doing a project at McKinsey, you need to deliver value for that client over 3, 6, 9 months. And when you're building a startup, you kind of think in those chunks of time. There's a lot of similarities in how you lead the team as well.
Very interesting. And then going back to that evolution that you were having. So you went Accenture, McKinsey, smaller companies, and then you end up in Boston Consulting and in e-commerce, right? So, and digital. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I was introduced to the head of the consumer practice there by a gentleman who I had worked for at McKinsey and had made his way to BCG via Carlyle Group. And they were having a bit of a pain point in terms of what is to go to market and how do we help our clients with e-commerce and digital more broadly, right? And the role they asked me to play was to help them craft their go-to-market proposition. I was what they call an associate director, but effectively an expert partner to lead the thinking on how do you help clients with e-commerce and digital. Yes, you can say build a new company and be innovative, but that's kind of taking an venture approach, which we all know most don't work, but these companies have to get it to work.
Yeah.
So,
and Karl,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was going to ask, when was this? Like, what just the time period, just in terms of like where was e-commerce in terms of its development?
It was around about 2015. So e-commerce was fairly established in terms of we knew was important for companies, and they knew, or usually knew. We did walk into businesses, but said to us, and I'm not going to name them, like literally, we don't believe e-commerce is going to be as big as you think. And you're asking us to think about our real estate in a way that makes it unproductive and a mistake for us to own it all. And we just think you're wrong and looking for revenue. So there was still companies saying your mindset is lovely, but it's not right. And then there was companies who were saying, look, we know we got to get this right. And actually, there was pure plays who nowadays probably wouldn't use a McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group, who would ask us around our broader strategy because, yes, they were building the business, but maybe they're not profitable yet. And where do they need to push the line? So I wouldn't call it early because e-commerce is around effectively since 2000, right? But it was a time when it was, when I was at McKinsey, we thought that was the time it was starting to scale, and my technology background was relevant. I think at 2015 it was really interesting that there was still disbelievers, but the data said you can't disbelieve.
No, absolutely. It's
And then,
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
yeah, sorry. And then you did that job at Boston Consulting, and then I think then came the other period of your career, which is going into big corporate. We have Pandora, JCPenney. How did that happen, and how was that? I mean, going into a big corporate like that in a C-level role, practically.
Yes, right. My first job in a corporate was a C-level role. But Pandora Jewelry were a client at Boston Consulting Group, and their CEO, Anders Kolding, asked me to come effectively as a consultant. Because I'd always said to BCG, and I think we were aligned on this, but this wasn't a long-term role for me. So when they asked me to do it, everybody was happy for me to do it. And I came in, and a few months later, they turned it into a full-time C-suite gig. And what was interesting in that role, and I really, really liked that role, and I learned some things about how corporate politics work that are different to a McKinsey or a startup. But from the point of view of how do you get stuff done and what does the company need to think about, there was no better training ground than Accenture, McKinsey, BCG, and startups, because you understand how technology is delivered. You understand how the strategy of the company is developed. You probably develop more strategies than most people in C-suites have, because you've done it over and over and over, and you've seen the results of them. But you've also built from the ground up and seen the results change as you build, and you've had to go fast and take chances. So it was a successful spell from a point of view of getting consumer experiences and technology change quickly and helping change the underbelly of the company digitally. I learned a lot. I won't say the hard way, but it wasn't easy in terms of how to bring a broad corporate along and how to work within a structure where, to be honest, not everybody wants the company to win at all costs, which is different than a consulting project usually a consulting project or a startup where you're all mission oriented. So that was probably, I remember on the flight to Denmark, a guy I hired to come with me said, what if they know what to do and we don't bring value? And I said, oh, no. That's not the problem. We know what to do, and it's going to be different to what they think to do. The challenge is not what to do, it's how to get it done. And that's what's different in a corporate than a startup. Getting it done is quite easy when everybody's mission oriented. It's just, are you doing the right things? A different problem.
No, absolutely. And I'm curious, you mentioned obviously that your tech background in your time at Accenture obviously kind of really positioned you, in essence, gave you a good starting point in terms of your foray into digital and e-com. But what was it about digital that, in essence, initially drew your interest in terms of like it being an area that you wanted to go and pursue?
I never actually pursued it. It's interesting. I did tech in Accenture almost by hook or by crook. I'd hoped to do strategy. I joined right after 9/11. The Dublin practice weren't doing strategy, and it was tech or bust, right? So I got into tech. Now, separate but linked to that, one of the reasons I chose Columbia for my MBA was their focus on finance, which is not something I wanted to work in, but I've always felt you should lean into your weaknesses and then work with your strengths, but don't let your weakness hold you back. So I found myself in my career having tech and finance pretty strong, despite the fact that they weren't necessarily places I wanted to work, or functions I wanted to work in. But what really drew me into digital, as we call it, was the market. It was, hey, you know how tech works. You've implemented tech, you built tech, you get strategy, you get consumer, you get retail. Can you be my digital guy? And I was like, sure, right? But it wasn't ever planned out that way. It was just I had the combination of things that what we call digital as an industry now I've done digital marketing. I've run creative teams. I've run brand teams. I've run e-commerce teams. I've run tech teams. I've run operations teams. At this point, obviously, I've been a CEO. But earlier, I'd worked in every function that adds together for digital. So it became, that's where my strengths are, and it's where the market's going. Why would I not lean into it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's interesting, though. A lot of things that we've talked about. First of all, the fact that you've changed jobs in your career and companies due to personal connections, which is interesting. It's not like applying to a role or even being headhunted, which is interesting, no? Because it just reinforces that idea of like, as long as a person is like smart and has things to say, it's good to network with people all the time as much as you can, right? Because in one way or the other, they'll bring a benefit. And the other one is ending up in digital in this case, but in other functions as well. I think going a bit with the flow, no? If it seems like the right thing to do, it's following that. Along these lines, actually, and coming from like the diverse background that you've had, what's your leadership style like today? Like with all the learnings that you've had, how have you built an effective leadership style? What to expect when Karl Walsh walks in the room?
Yeah, and it'll continue to evolve, Daniel. I expect and hope. I think I see a lot of very experienced people saying they mellowed as they got older. And I'm not sure mellow is the word I'd use as I've gotten older, but certainly more thoughtful. Not that I wasn't thoughtful to begin with, but I think what I've learned is you can be incredibly strong in terms of accountability and clarity of what you expect of people and clarity of purpose, but also be extremely empathetic and be a coach and a mentor. And I think a lot of leaders sort of think of those things as in somewhat opposition to each other, that if you sit with somebody and they can acknowledge they don't know how to do exactly what you need done, and you'll spend time teaching them, and you'll understand where they are in life and why it's a hard moment for them, but somehow you're not holding them accountable, and that's not true. And I've had a lot of people who I've had to let go who I still have very strong relationships with, because in the end, if you work with people, they can learn that they actually don't have the skill or maybe even the desire, frankly, to learn how to do what you need done. So if that is the case, it's not good for them and it's not good for you. Now, do they understand why you need it done that way? If they don't, then they're going to think you're the bad guy. So taking the time to really work with people and the team in general on, here's the strategy, here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there, here's the work that has to happen to get us there, and here's each of your roles within that. And then for the sake of everybody in that team, you got to hold everybody super accountable along the way. But along the way, you can also, like I said, be empathetic and be a coach and be a mentor. And I think the more experience I've gotten and the more elements of the work I've done myself, the better you can be as a true coach, as opposed to sort of up here saying things that make sense but doesn't help the person develop. So that, I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's a combination of those two. But I certainly try to hold myself accountable too.
Yeah, that requires a certain amount of investment in terms of time, no? If coaching really means like looking everyone in the eye and thinking of every person, you have to sit with them, you have to think about it later, and then you have to go back with them and give them that valuable feedback and follow up.
I mean, most of your time as a leader, I mean, I'll go to my CEO role in my last job. I mean, if you're spending all day, every day moving buttons on the side and changing nuances of creative and marketing, you don't have a team. You're not doing your job. So most of your time is setting the vision and the strategy and building and coaching the team to execute on it. And holding them accountable is almost as important as setting the vision. And people believing in what you as a collective are doing is so much more powerful than I think a lot of people give it credit for. And I learned this at JCPenney during the pandemic, where the ability to check in with people every day by Zoom and to spend time with people and truly call them and say, hey, you seem to be having a hard time. How are you doing? And here's why this is important for the business. And obviously that business is in a critical place. Everybody understood that if we rode together and drove exponential results relative to expectations, that this company would get out of bankruptcy and they would all have jobs and a legacy institution would survive. And the energy and work with with what I got from that team during a time when most people were saying to me, how do people engage? My team are disengaging. It was really interesting, but everybody was literally on the same bus, going to the same place. So if you think about somebody getting out of bed at 7, 8, 9 a.m., logging onto Zoom and genuinely spending 8 to 12 hours a day trying to further the needs of that organization, picking up the phone at 4 p.m. and saying, how you doing? You seem tired, doesn't seem like such a give anymore, right? So it's a two-way street. They have to be giving too.
Yeah. What I also hear from what your experiences have been is that it seems to me like you're also very transparent in regards to your communication style, and that it's like you're open with sharing in terms of like, I'm asking you to do this, but I'm asking because of this greater goal or objective that we have, and this is what it ultimately is going to strive towards. It's like, I think that culture of transparency, I think, is really important, whether it's a startup or like a corporation.
I don't know how to lead people any other way. And it's funny, I've been in the US since I was 26, so I'm not sure what's American and Irish at this point, but people say to me I'm very candid, and I'm like, but what you're really saying is other people keep lying to you. I don't understand why. But in the end, I think you have to have transparency with people. And one of the things you find as you lead larger teams and people are more career oriented is everybody wants to know what's in it for them, at least at the start. But I think it's always there, and it makes sense. We're all human. And I've sort of developed a model in my head that says the first year of a role, and it can be 6 months, but let's use years. The first year of a role, you're learning. If you've chosen the right role and the company's chosen the right person, yeah, you're bringing something to the table, but you should be learning. So the company's investing in you. And then the second period, let's call it a year, is break even. You're giving as much as you're getting. And then in the third year, you're giving more than you're getting. And that's when you start saying, I want to move on. So, and for some people who are exceptional, they can be 4-month periods, but the blocks tend to be quite similar in size. And what I say to people is like, look, at some point you got to invest in me. At some point I got to invest in you. So when you're asking me what's in this for you, it's to do a kick-ass job for me so you get to phase 3 where I owe you something and you get your next role. So right now your goal is the corporate mission. But what you have to do if you make those promises to people and speak to them that way is you have to acknowledge when they head into that phase where, hey, you've been doing this work in customer care, you know the customer inside out, you've been nailing it, you've made your team smaller, you're now in the give back phase. It's time for you to get to work on the fitness app and develop your skill set and move to the next phase of your career. Now I'm going to have to spend a lot of personal time helping you do that because you've never done it before. And we can't fail. So now I owe you. And it's that cycle with everybody who works for me that we're in together, that then you ask them to do that down. It creates a culture of we're aiming for certain goals as a company. They come first, but we acknowledge we're all humans with career goals and we manage them within that greater good. That's the goal for me when I'm building a team.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned also that you of course, after Pandora, you step into JCPenney, which obviously everybody's heard about in the press that at the time you joined, and probably now too, is a company that's been extremely challenged. How did you manage that situation from a leadership standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really fun role for me. I loved it there. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I mean, one of the things when you've got the experience and background I have is sometimes the things that are wrong in terms of the process and how you're working as a team and the consumer journey and how you're curating it and the way you're using your technology. And I chose my words carefully there, not the technology you're using, the way you're using it. There's low-hanging fruit. And at the scale of a JCPenney, if you fix both or all of the front-end experience, the process at which you go to market, and the way your team curates the experience within that, all at the same time, you just see a huge uptick in revenue and margin without having done any major projects or investment. Now, that is all leadership and that is all team. So I brought in a couple of people with me early, worked really closely with the team, to your point on investing in the team, a huge amount of time, not just the next level down, but skip level and skip level. Just you guys own the consumer journey, let's get it right. And we saw really quick and exciting results. And it was a team. The thing about that company was they loved the company. They wanted to succeed and they're willing to learn and do whatever. So I saw them lose their comfort zone, but they didn't lose their desire to make it work. So that was a really fun job. But that was, at Pandora, we put a lot of technology in place because there was fundamental technology lacking for for that company to succeed in an omni-channel environment. And we got it in place and it had a big impact on results. At Penny's, they had spent a lot of money on technology and we worked on that. And that's what I was brought in to do. And that drove huge results. So it was kind of fun because there were other sides of the same coin. And it was a very different challenge, but a very rewarding one all the same. So different companies ask you to do different things.
I love that that your the way you phrase it, like you said, it's about the way you use your technology, not the technology you're using. Because to me, it just speaks about sweating your assets in a way, as opposed to going out and just doing new projects or acquiring new technologies for the sake of something new, something innovative.
Efren, I'll give you a very tangible example. I've used this. It's so simple that I'm not insulting anybody, but every company I've been brought into, whether it be as a consultant or as a leader, tells me we need a CDP. We're waiting on a CDP. Therefore, we have no personalization, right? You've seen the record. Every marketing department, we don't have the tools. Well, do you do A/B testing? Oh, yeah. What do you use? And typically, it's, let's just say, Adobe Test and Target. Well, so what do you do with that? You pick a segment, you choose what you think you want to show them, you show it to them, and you monitor results. How is that different to, say, at JCPenney, picking big and tall, giving them big and tall content and checking the results? And that's personalization. So you do have tools for personalization, right? You're just choosing not to use them because it takes a little bit of brain power and a little bit of work. While waiting for a CDP and pointing at the technology team doesn't take a lot of brain power or work, and you have the beauty of every industry peer telling your CEO the same thing, which is, yeah, you need a CDP. So you're buying time to know how to do your job. Well, my job is to go in and make them do their jobs with the tools they have. Well, and what that actually does is it builds the business case for the CDP. Because now your CFO can see, oh, well, what we're doing, can we scale that? Well, not really, right? And then, so it's always about using the assets you have better, whilst in parallel, making sure you're investing in the assets for the future.
Sorry, I'm gonna sound very stupid here, but what does CDP mean?
It's a consumer data platform. So the idea is, Daniel, is a lot of companies spent a lot of money on what they call data swamps or data lakes, which is to combine all the different disparate pieces of consumer data into one place so that you can then speak to them as one. So at a Penny's example would be they bought on the store, they bought online, they're in our marketing database. Well, how do we know who they are, right? A CDP is a commoditized version of that, but has parameters. So you implement it and it's used to all the endpoints. So instead of building ground up, you put it in, connect pieces, and it's the fast track to getting the data lake built. But it also stops you messing it up technically because it has parameters you got to work with. Now, all of that would say, great, but if what every brand owner tells us is true, but 80% of their consumers start their journey online, well, you already have the e-commerce data in the e-commerce database. So why don't you start using that for personalization while you wait for the CDP? Why do you need the perfect cross-channel view of the customer to talk to them based on what they've definitely told you, which is they always buy black sneakers? You know that. Now, you could make the assumption that when they go to the store, they buy pink, white, yellow, and they only buy black online. Well, it's okay. So now you're talking to them online about what they buy online. Is that bad? It's better than ignoring what they've told you. So that's sort of the discussion, is use what you have while building out more versus waiting for what the tech companies are telling you you need.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was in a meeting last week, and they mentioned to me that somebody mentioned done is better than perfect, right? So if you just wait for perfection, you will never get there, right? And you will always find a reason as to why you can't do this because you're constantly waiting.
So let me contradict myself or challenge, because I've heard that a lot and I've used that. Here's the thing: I've seen chief technology officers, and I've been a chief technology officer, so I understand how this happens. They put up charts that show Microsoft Dynamics tick, Adobe Test and Target tick, Salesforce Commerce Cloud tick, and they show you the list of all the systems they put in place, and they're all ticked, and they go, look what we've done, and the team's still not happy. And they would say what we just said: done is better than perfect, right? Now the problem is, in many cases, in order to get that many ticks in a row, they put in minimum viable product, but the V stands for viable, means the business can use it. It doesn't mean for viable the tech works, right? So they can look the CEO in the eye and say, I've given the team all these tools, and they keep looking at me. It's them, and it's fair. But was done better than perfect in these examples? Did you bring the business along and say, what is the viable use of this tool to drive the business outcome you're looking for? It's absolutely correct that done is better than perfect, but the done has to be business outcome created, not technology implemented, right? And that's where the silos between a tech team and a go-to-market team and a marketing team lead to, depending on the CEO, a power battle that in some cases the tech team has made sprint to put the whole thing in perfect for the marketing team, disaster, right? Because it never gets done. And in some cases the tech team gets to say, I did it, now you need to figure it out, and then they blame the agency. And neither of those work. They need to genuinely collaborate and define done.
Definitely.
And Karl, I know in your last role, you were a chief executive officer. It was the first time you had that title. It was, of course, an eminently online business, bodybuilding.com. But how was it for you to move from a functional role, even if it's at a C-level, into a CEO function?
Yeah, it was interesting. In a way, it's the same insofar as the size of the company dictated that a lot of what CEOs and huge companies do, besides their check-ins with you and facilitate leadership meetings, is kind of leave you to it because there's so much on their plate. But a company the size of bodybuilding.com, I spoke to the board every week. I could text the owner and chat. So the board management piece and that was kind of not such a big issue. So I could spend a lot of time with the team driving the day-to-day results. So that was fun. I will say a lot of time in finance, a lot of time on legal. You spend an awful lot of your energy on things, but you just have to get right as opposed to why the business is going to succeed. So it probably took me about 3 to 6 months to learn, hey, you need to step back and make sure you're doing strategy, make sure you're doing the coaching and investing in the team and doing the things that have made you successful. And if that means texting your owner and saying, look, I can't have another chat this Monday, I'm too busy, you do it. What you don't do is humor your owner and let down yourself in terms of what you know drives value for that company. So it took me a few months to get my head around that. Once I got that, I would say really, really enjoyed the role, very open to doing it again. We had great success in terms of our outcome. There were moments where you're like, I kind of miss being part of the team complaining about the CEO. And I say that as a human because I always loved my bosses, but sometimes it's nice to get a beer and sort of criticize the strategy. But when you're the CEO, it's just you, right? Yeah. But it was. They say it's lonely at the top. At moments it was lonely, but I would say incredibly validating and on net extremely rewarding.
Yeah, no, I that's exactly what was going through my mind as you were saying that. Is like, sometimes like it can be very lonely the higher you get in a company because there's fewer and fewer people to have that beer with and commiserate.
But as a CEO, I define it as people think you're at the top. I think you're in the middle of the hourglass. So whether it's a public company and its investors or it's a private company and its investors, you can't go up in the hourglass and say, guys, I'm kind of lost here. You can't do it. They'll lose confidence and it's over. And you can't go down and tell the team you're kind of lost here. So whenever you're trying to figure out what to do, that's a you job. Now you can push it on your team and say, we need to figure it out together. And to a point, you bring them along, but you need to get there or you lose them. And likewise, the board. So the moment I realized I was in the middle of an hourglass and not at the top was the moment I think I got good at my job, which is you've stopped fighting the fact that you can't ask for help up or down in the way you used to, right? You now are the focal point of it. And it's why a lot of CEOs have professional coaches. It's not actually because they're semi-crazy and need help. It's because it's somebody to talk to where you're not risking the ability to execute as a team. And having those people, I think, is really important for a CEO.
Yeah. No. So I had one question, which is, given that you've actually led digital transformation in so many companies in a variety of different roles, whether it be as a consultant, whether it be as the head of digital or the CEO itself, I'm curious to hear if you've got some key lessons that you've learned along the way that you would share with us in terms of what are 2 or 3 nuggets of wisdom you would share with others who are either already on that journey or or maybe late to the game and are starting that journey at their respective companies.
Yeah, no, great question. There's a few things coming to mind. So way back when I was at BCG, I was asked by a firm, can I build them a digital strategy? And I said, no such thing. I can build you a strategy that respects the world where we are today, and it's very digital, right? But it can't be its own thing. And likewise, digital transformation is a term I think we'll see phased out. And I played the CDO role many times, and I really enjoy it. But I think in the long term, that role will be phased out. Because in the end, marketing need to run marketing and tech need to run tech. So I think from an organizational perspective, transformation is constant and it's accelerating because of the tools we have at our disposal today. And when you're transforming it with respect to digital, but don't see it as a digital transformation, the reason being your tech team will start to feel you're pointing at them and you won't necessarily bring people along. It's you strategically need to change where you allocate your assets and resources and time based on the world you're in. So I think that lens can help clarify what you're trying to achieve. I think this is obvious, but you have to bring the whole company with you. You can't, have a sidebar conversation, but says we're going to change how we do this, and then we'll tell people. One simple example is in one of the companies I worked with, the marketing team were nervous because with my background, they felt I'm so digitally native, but I won't respect them. And I had to pull them aside and say, guys, in the end, you know this brand so well, which is something only you guys know. And you know how this company has operated for years, which is only you guys know in the whole world. There's so many people who think they can optimize ad spend. In the end, the CAC is dictated by the market. The LTV is based on what you're trying to do relative to what you know, only you know. So my options are A, bring you along and have a world-class digital team, but know this business inside out. Or B, replace you with people who have no idea if they're good or not, can talk the talk and don't know the business. I choose A, but you have to come with me. And it's a mindset, not a skill set, but you have to shift because the skills are not that hard. It's like if column A is more LTV than column B, you move to spend unless strategically there's a reason to be in column B. You don't need to have done digital for 20 years to know that. So I think bringing people along, being clear on what the mission is, and then, the last piece of it is it's not that hard. It's really not. I mean, if you need an order management system, but there's a number of things and eight different vendors tell you it's going to take 6 months and you need 2 months discovery before you start, and one vendor tells you they can do it in 8 weeks. Yeah, we've all done construction projects in our house. You don't take the cheapest builder with the cheapest timeline if you want your house to stay up, right? So you use your logic and stop looking for shortcuts. This stuff has to be built properly, and do your work. It's quite straightforward.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. I mean, and it's interesting, I think, that you said, I mean, it's like a lot of things in leadership, no? It's really about getting people on board, no? It's not about necessarily digital transformation, about hiring people with digital experience or upskilling necessarily everybody. Just really, probably it's related also to showing them the vision of the company and what the company has to be, no, ultimately.
100%. I mean, if they don't understand why you're making the changes you're making and why it's for the benefit of everybody, including them, then all you're doing is moving their cheese and making their jobs harder and putting angst on people. And, as a leader and somebody who is where I am in life, I enjoy change. I revel in it. A lot of people I've learned do not. And you got to manage it carefully for them and bring them along. And I think everybody knows that intuitively. It's just when the pressure gets ratcheted up, people tend to step back. That's when you step forward.
Yeah. And with all these experiences in your career, Karl, if you had to go back to yourself when you were a fresh graduate, what type of advice would you give your younger self now that with all these lessons learned?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it. There's kind of a couple of things that come to mind, but we've touched on it through the arc of this conversation around following the road. And if I think of, if I was advising myself, and Daniel, I might advise somebody else differently, but knowing myself, there are two things I would say. It's really important to look around corners and try to see where you're going, but stop panicking about what's around the corner, because guess what? It's there. So if you're in a role you don't like and you don't see it working out, you can spend an awful lot of time trying to change that reality and willing the world to be different, or you can acknowledge, hey, if I stay in this role, I think this company is going to end up in the next place. It's going to be a bad place for me. I should exit. And to the point Efraim made earlier, I've worked for a lot of the same people over and over in my career, so I'm a very loyal person. But you still need to know when to exit. Trying to change the will of a company and what's right for the company, it's just unhealthy. And linked to that, advice my father gave me in 2013, I think, when I was totally burnt out in New York, is your job is not to make as much success as you can for yourself. Your job is to make as much success as you can whilst doing what you enjoy. And it's a very different mindset, because I could definitely make more money doing things I don't like, but would I be happier? And I could definitely make way less money doing things I love, but would I be happier? And you're trying to find that balance. But I think accepting that maximizing wealth is not necessarily the goal of your career. And I think in the US, that's probably more pertinent maybe than in Europe, where people know that. But I do think the two of those things together, don't worry, you'll figure it out, and stop trying to maximize wealth and make sure you're figuring out in a way you enjoy.
This was Karl Walsh. Very interesting conversation. Efrain, what are your conclusions?
Well, I really enjoyed listening to Karl and hearing him talk about just the diversity of the experiences that he's had, and how he's been able to, in essence, take what he's learned or the skills that he's built and being able to apply them in new spaces or new arenas is really interesting. I think it's a great learning for a lot of us as we think about our careers and progression.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can just, by speaking to him, you can just see how much value it adds to have all these experiences, from consulting, entrepreneurship, and then working in big corporations. It's really interesting to hear and to see. So it's good advice, good career advice for everybody, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's something all of us can try to aspire to, which is finding our next role. You never know where it's going to come from, right? He talked about like sitting next to a complete stranger on a flight, and it ultimately led to the next company that he joined. It's really interesting also just to hear Karl's perspective in regards to the work he's done in the digital space, and how he says he doesn't develop standalone digital strategy. It's part of the overall strategy of the company and the overall transformation. So part of that is also bringing the right mindset to the work that he's doing in that space as well.
Yeah, also I think from a mindset leadership perspective, I believe like the part of like being close to people, but still being very direct and holding them accountable. It's obviously not an easy balance to keep, but he seems to have been successful leading this way.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that, he also articulated quite clearly that he talked about maintaining desire outside of your comfort zone, right? So it's looking for those new challenges and new ways to grow. Again, I think is really sound advice for a lot of us, in terms of as we think about our careers as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Well, thanks, Efrain, for your conclusions. Thanks for our loyal audience for tuning in again. Remember also, if you're not yet, to follow us on LinkedIn, as well as our friends at the other side of the Atlantic, the CPG guys. We're creating more and more content, everything omni retail, a lot of interesting stuff they've been doing on their LinkedIn lives lately. And thanks for joining again, and we'll see you in the next episode.